Welcome to Talk is Cheap. Today we're going to be talking about the weather with Bruce Watson, who is a consulting meteorologist. And welcome to the show, Bruce.
Thank you, Mark. Nice to be here.
You know, you've been here before, and you might have even told me this, but how did you get into being a meteorologist? Where along the line did you decide this is what I want to do?
Okay, well, it sort of evolved. When I was little, I was always interested in weather. I liked to watch the storms and everything. And as time went on, I got into school. My father always wanted me to be a lawyer. And a lot of people thought I should be a priest or something. But the thing is that as time went on, what happened is that I had quite an experience when I was in 1943, when I was 11 years old. But I was a person who always liked to get at the truth, and I guess that's why people thought I should be a priest or a lawyer, because I was always arguing everything, trying to get the truth. But what had happened is I visited my uncle who lived in Milwaukee, and I started to talk to the kids in Milwaukee. Now, in my little town that I grew up in, Wisconsin, you know, we sort of were taught the creationism and all that kind of stuff, you know. And these kids told me that we came from monkeys. And I said, that's not what I learned in school. And I went to the public schools in Eau Claire, and in 4th grade, we, you know, got into Bible studies and that to some extent. Anyway, when I got back home, I went to the local library, the adult section, of course, and I looked this whole thing up. And there I discovered that indeed we were descended from a lower form of life, and that evolution was true. And I could see that science was a much purer way to find the truth than debate. A minister or a lawyer tries to find truth through debate, by debating, whereas in science you do it by observation and by checking and rechecking, by the sifting and winnowing process, and that is a much better way to arrive at truth. So from then on, I was interested in science, and my favorite science was meteorology. I was always interested in astronomy too, but I guess meteorology is what I like the best because I like to watch the storms.
What's the history of predicting weather? Is it a fairly new science in this century, or does it go way back in time?
Oh, the first book on weather was written by Aristotle. It was called Meteorologist, and so it goes way back to the ancient Greeks.
So he was making daily weather predictions and.
Oh yeah, Aristotle tried to explain. I don't know if you read, or any of the people watching have read Aristotle's works, but Aristotle tried to explain. You know, that which happened. It was sort of a compendium of knowledge that he put together. And of course, a lot of the stuff that he has is accurate. Other things he had a conjecture on, and other things, of course, was downright myth. But Aristotle's books, his works for a long time, constituted more or less the body of learning. Now, the Greeks, of course, were very, we really don't appreciate in our Western world the high level of civilization that Greece reached. But Greece learned a great deal about meteorology. In Athens, they had this Tower of the Winds that was built way back in the ancient times. But the Greeks did know, they knew a great deal about meteorology. And we just, in this Western world of ours, we're so oriented toward England and France and Italy, Germany, Spain, that we really don't appreciate the ancient knowledge that the people in the Eastern world had, the Greeks and the Arabs, the Hebrews, these people, the Phoenicians. These people knew a great deal about the weather. Imagine the Phoenicians navigating around the Mediterranean Sea. Those sailors had to know what to look for as far as storms are concerned. If the Phoenicians didn't know a lot about weather, they never could have sailed the Mediterranean. Same with the Greeks. The Greeks established these colonies in places like Palermo in Sicily, Naples, in eastern Spain, in north part of Africa. You had your Greek sailors going around, and they couldn't possibly get around if they didn't know a lot about the weather and how to avoid the storms.
Now,
So weather is a very ancient science.
Now, I'm guessing that in the last 50 years, the study of the weather and predicting has changed a great deal because of technology. But in the times you're talking about, was most of theirs based upon observation, or did they have some sort of instruments that they used for making measurements and predictions?
Oh, the Greeks, of course, they almost invented science. You might say they're the ones that came up with this concept of the scientific method. And the Greeks did know a great deal and did a great deal of science. Remember, the Greeks actually computed the diameter of the Earth quite accurately.
Oh, really?
Yeah, science was very advanced. In fact, the Greeks were way ahead of most of the rest of the world for a long time in science, way ahead. But can you imagine that this was about 4,000 years ago that they computed the diameter of the Earth, and only 700 years ago, almost everybody believed the world was flat. And of course,
I was going to say, I guess Columbus didn't listen to what the Greeks.
Yeah, you know, are you aware that even President Andrew Jackson thought the world was flat?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, it's that recent. I mean, the idea of a round Earth did not completely get to everybody until the past century. But Andrew Jackson says any fool can look out and see it's flat.
So you didn't believe this Magellan stuff?
Apparently not. But some of these people that have ruled as president weren't very educated people.
Uh-huh. So what you're saying is that they did have some ways for making measurements in the Greeks.
They certainly did. And they did make measurements.
Okay, we're going to take a short break, and then we'll be right back with more about the weather.
Calling all sports fans. Now reach out and touch someone using the official phone of your favorite pro team. Introducing Team Phones.
You can't use that long-distance company's slogan. You're going to be sued.
Oh, well, Team Phones are officially licensed by the NFL, NBA, Major League Baseball, and the NHL. There's a team phone for all 109 pro teams. And they don't just look good. Team phones are loaded with great features like big buttons, a lighted keypad, auto redial, wall or desk mount, and a full 3-year warranty. Team phones are great for your office, your home, anywhere you want to show your true colors. And what a perfect gift for any sports fan. So call now and order a team phone for your favorite team from any pro sport: baseball, football, basketball, or hockey. Get the team phone of your favorite pro team. Call 1-800-351-6100 or send check or money order for $59.95 plus $7.90 shipping and handling to the address on your screen. Choose from any pro sport: football, basketball, hockey, or baseball. Call 1-800-351-6100. Sorry, no CODs.
We're back at Talk is Cheap with Bruce Watson, and we're talking about the weather today. Bruce, before we started the show, you were telling us a little bit about what right now you're doing as a meteorologist. I think probably a lot of people believe meteorologists are the guys on TV, but actually that's probably just the tip of the iceberg of what meteorologists are, who they're working for and what they're doing. But you personally, what areas are you specializing in now?
Yeah, okay, Mark, it's very interesting, the concept that people have of meteorologists. Up until about 1974, most people, their concept of a meteorologist was something that worked for the Weather Bureau. Mm-hmm. And of course, at that time, probably 90% of the meteorologists in the country did work for the Weather Bureau. Right about 1974, there was then a shift to television where most people, the meteorologists that they were familiar, were with TV, not with the Weather Service.
Mm-hmm. The Weather Window on WCCO with Bud Kraling.
Right. So about 1974 is when you had, and of course nowadays almost everybody, when they think of meteorologists, they say, what TV station are you on? Well, actually there's many meteorologists that are not on television at all and don't work for the Weather Bureau, and I've always fell in that category. I initially began working for, first of all, I joined the Army. And I was a weather forecaster. I forecasted weather at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, mm-hmm. and then out in Fort Detrick, Maryland, and down at Avon Park Air Force Base in Florida, Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, for a while out in Utah. Mm-hmm. So that was really my first job. But
so I assume the Armed Forces have a lot of use for knowing what's going to happen with the weather.
Yeah, especially the Air Force, but well, and the Navy and Army too. They all really need to know about the weather. You can't really launch a and offensive unless you know what the weather's going to be. You have to know what kind of gear to give the troops so that when they get into battle and everything, and as they roll along, they have raincoats on if it's going to rain, and that they're prepared if it does rain. And of course, some of the very famous battles that have been won and lost have been because of weather. But anyway, I got in after I got out of the Army, my honorable discharge. I then went to work for the Army right at my last duty station, which was Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. And there I worked for Meteorology Division, both as a soldier and as a civilian. And this is where I got into weather radar, and I got into satellite meteorology also there. Our unit actually was working on satellite meteorology years before the first weather satellite went up, because we knew that it was going to go up. So in fact, the unit that took place at the satellite unit at NASA that eventually took over was born out of our unit at Fort Monmouth. And incidentally, we were doing work on Doppler radar way back when I was working there.
What is Doppler radio?
Back in the 50s.
Radar.
Well, Doppler radar, what it does is it sends out a pulse, and you use the Doppler effect. Like if you hear a train going along and it's blowing its whistle continuously, you'll notice it changes its pitch. Well, that's true of anything that's moving along. If you send out an electrical signal and when it bounces back, if it's moving, it's going to change its pitch, so to speak. Therefore, you can tell if it's coming toward you. And here with weather, we're talking about raindrops. We can see if the raindrops are coming toward us, going away from us, or just which way they're going, and also how fast they're going. So this is where, and of course, Doppler radar is now replacing the old radar, which only told you where the precipitation was and something about its intensity. And that's one thing we worked on too, of course, was the intensity. And just a couple of days ago at the university, they had the Earl Kunis lectures, and I saw some of my old buddies that were working on some of these things way back in the 1950s. But anyway, what I did was get into research then. And so I spent actually the time from 1956 when I was discharged until 1969 mostly doing research work, and most of it actually out in the field. We would go out and gather data and then come back and analyze and then write learned papers for the journals or for I was every time that I worked in all this, it was with the Defense Department, either the Army, the Navy, or a contractor that was usually contracting to the Air Force. So I did work for all three branches of service in that time era. But my field work took me to a lot of places. It took me out into Nevada, where I saw a few dozen atomic bombs go off. It took me to Pikes Peak. I worked on Pikes Peak for a couple of years. It took me out to the New Jersey coast, where I worked in pouring rain. The field projects, go on in weather. You're usually looking for bad weather. So a lot of times we're out there when you have a cold rain. It's about 32 degrees and a gale blowing off the Atlantic. We were out in a lot of that. So I did this field work and this field research up until '69, and then in '69, of course, this was mostly with contracts. So usually the typical project lasted 2 or 3 years. But in '69, my kids had entered grade school, and I wanted to stay here in Minnesota, especially I like the north suburban area. So I've been here ever since, and so I became an independent consultant back in '69, and I've been a full-time independent consultant since then.
Okay, and you had said a lot of your work involves agriculture.
Right. There's three main things that I do now. One is I write for farm magazines, and I write for more farm magazines than anybody else in the country. I'm #1 in the country on writing for weather for farm magazines. Second thing I do a fair amount of work on investigating storms and such where litigation is involved. Airplane crashes, boat accidents, automobiles, trains, buses, building collapses, people get killed, people fall down and get hurt, that sort of thing. The third thing I do quite a bit of is write equations for computer programs where weather's involved, either directly, like I've worked on a couple single station forecast models that I generated that I use, and I also have contributed to equations to a lot of models everything from Star Wars to storm sewers. In actuality, I've helped to develop models for storm sewer drainage and also models for the Star Wars so-called, well, the strategic defense initiative, like SDI, or the common name was Star Wars.
I would guess that the computers changed things in the weather world a great deal.
Yeah, it did, and I was on the ground floor at Fort Monmouth. This is the unit of the Army that was responsible for using computers for scientific investigations. So I got into computers with my very first civilian job at Fort Monmouth. And that's when I started to write these. I was already writing computer programs back in the 1950s.
Okay.
I write the equations for them. I don't bother to get in and remember all these languages. I give that to the computer programmers, and they take my equations and put them into the language.
Okay. We're going to take a short break, and then we'll be back with more about the weather.
Foster Brooks, the man who took Johnny Carson by surprise.
I said, well, what happened? He said, well, by the time we got a hole cut in the ice big enough for the motorboat, we were too tired to fish.
Appearing for 10 consecutive years in Las Vegas in the largest casinos. Jack Benny once said, no one wants to follow Foster on stage. Call the number on your screen now and order the funniest man alive. This veteran of The Tonight Show, The Dean Martin Roast, The Bill Cosby Show, The Smothers Brothers Show, and countless other TV shows.
I had one brother-in-law went ice fishing one day, brought him 200 pounds of ice. His wife fried it, and they both drowned. Held it up to his own head, just like that, and she started laughing. He said, don't laugh, you're next.
The master of nightclub comedy will delight you with the funniest video ever. Now, here's how to order. Call the number on your screen and ask for the Foster Brooks video for only $19.95, plus $4.95 shipping and handling per tape.
Is cocaine crack or is crack cocaine?
You were going to talk to her?
You were going to talk to her.
I think it's time that we had a little talk. We'll talk about it later.
No, it's time. It's important.
If you had any questions you wanted to ask me, honey, you would ask your father, wouldn't you?
Right. I'm just going to tell my kid that if he ever tries it, I'll kill him. All right?
That's sensitive, Al.
If you need help talking to your kids about drugs, call for this free book.
We're back at Talk is Cheap. Before that break, Bruce, you mentioned writing for agriculture magazines. I would guess the farmers probably depend upon the weather just about as much as any industry out there. And I would guess most of our listeners have probably heard of the Farmer's Almanac.
Right.
I assume you're talking about something a little bit different than the Farmer's Almanac, though.
Well, the Farmer's Almanac actually, I guess, does have a meteorologist on board now.
Oh.
It didn't back in the olden days. In fact, I guess the way they used to forecast, at least some people have conjectured, and Farmer's Almanac may or may not deny this. I don't know what they would stand they would take on it. But if you look in the 1846 edition of the Farmer's Almanac, they give a weather forecasting method. And a lot of people have felt that that was the method that they used for a long time. Incidentally, that method also did appear in some British publications. Almanacs go back a long ways. They go, I guess, way back to the 15th century or something like that. And at one time, this one particular forecast method did appear in there. And but if anybody has the 1846 Farmer's Almanac laying around, they can see how some people think the Farmer's Almanac forecasted it for a long time.
Now, I'm sure you've heard a lot of the ways people say you can predict the weather. How long is the hair on a horse, or the woolly bully caterpillars. Is there any truth to any of those wives' tales?
Mark, there's a lot of truth in in a lot of the weather sayings. Some of them are hokum, and some of them actually apply in some areas of the world, but not in others. But many of them are universally true, like red sky at night, sailor's delight, red sky in the morning, sailor's warning. That's true. There's also a lot of truth in the groundhog legend, believe it or not. Yes, there is, at least here in Minnesota. But a lot of people say, well, that has to be hogwash. But being a researcher, I thought, well, before we just reject this out of hand, maybe there is something to it. So I made a study, and I found out that about in 85% of those times when the sky all day is sunny on Groundhog Day, in other words, 100% of total sunshine recorded in Minneapolis, that 85% of the time you actually are followed by cold weather. In other words, the groundhog was sure to see his shadow no matter when he came out during the daytime, because the sun shined all day. 85% of the time, the weather did average below normal in February, and 85% of the time, it averaged below normal in March. So there you got your 6 weeks of winter plus the extra week tossed in. Take the cloudy weather, the same thing happens the other way. Now, there's a reason for that. When I stop to think of it, there is a reason for that. Because if the weather is clear, if you have 100% of possible sunshine, this means that you almost are surely dominated by a continental polar air mass that's very dry. And if you have such a strong hold on the weather on February 2nd by such an air mass that you get sunshine all day long, that means that you must have some very cold air. And persistence, of course, is one thing that is one of the best forecasters, and persistence carries you through to cold weather in February and March. On the other hand, if you have all day cloudy on February 2nd, what this means, you almost surely have a Pacific air mass, and a real strong one at that. If you have Pacific air is warm, and of course that's associated with warm winters. So it turns out that there's a lot of truth to the groundhog tale as it pertains to the Twin Cities. Now, this doesn't mean that it would work, say, in Seattle. It might not work in Boston. Maybe it doesn't work in London. Maybe it does. But the thing is, it does work fairly well here in Minnesota.
Now, for some of these wives' tales, we're talking about not a real long prediction of what the weather is. You're working on predictions that are much longer that a farmer can rely on. Am I correct there?
Well, no. My forecasts are generally, most of them are within the next 60 days.
Okay.
What I specialize in is 30 to 60 days. And then after that, 90 days to 6 months. In other words, 1 to 2 months from now, and then from 2 months to 6 months from now. That's the time period that I specialize in.
Okay. So back last March and April, were you starting to see any kind of signs that we were going to have a wet summer and it was going to be cooler?
Well, there was a good hunch for a cool summer. Because we've been so cool the year before, and we had been so warm for so many summers before that it was obvious that the previous summer we had a change in regime, and so it was not a big surprise that this summer was cool. I don't think that next summer is going to be a hot summer by any means. Now, it'll probably be warmer than this summer was, but I would say it's probably, as summers go, it's probably going to be pretty cool again.
Cool and wet, dry?
Well, okay, now just how much precipitation falls is a little bit iffy. I'm almost sure it's going to be not as wet as this year was. But the thing is, we got two things operating here. One, we have this 20 and 40-year drought cycle that I like to talk about. And right now we are in the dry part of that. The dry part started in 1987 and should last us until 1996. So we got 3 more years to go on the general dry period. On the other hand, when we do get these general dry periods, you only usually get about maybe 2 years of that are really dry. Well, we had that right off the bat in 87 and 88. 87 and 88 were record dry months in the Twin Cities. And of course, that came off a very wet period. This followed 19 77 to 1986 actually was the wettest 10 years in the history of the Twin Cities, going way, way back to 1836 when records began. So we came off a very wet period, and when we went into the dry period, we hit the ground running. And we had two extremely dry years in 87 and 88. Now that almost sort of used up the really wet, or the really dry time of this 10-year cycle. But, excuse me, Mark, we do have something else going on, and that is, in general, our climate is getting wetter. This has been happening since the 1930s, is that we seem to be progressively getting wetter and wetter. So we have two things operating. One, the general progression is toward wetness, but the cycle would still call for some dryness. So if you want to have me give my estimate of how much rainfall, say, the Twin Cities Airport will get next year, I'll say 29.5 inches.
Okay.
Well, which is considerably drier than this year, but it's still above normal.
What is normal? What's the benchmark?
Normal for the airport is down around 26 inches. Normal for my location is about 32 inches. You have to remember that the normal precipitation varies greatly across the Twin Cities area. The northern suburbs are much wetter than the south part of the Twin Cities. Like Bloomington is relatively dry, whereas Roseville, White Bear Lake, Shoreview, Arden Hills, New Brighton, on over to New Hope, that is your wet belt, and eastward to Stillwater. Stillwater is also in the wet belt.
How much difference are we talking about here?
You're talking about 5-6 inches
a year. That's significant.
Oh, that's a lot. And of course, about 95% of that is in the summertime. So our summers are considerably wetter up here than they are down there.
Okay.
And this means that in the northern suburbs, we have to water a lot less, for instance.
Okay. Well, I can see Steve's going like this, so we've run out of time for this show, but Bruce has promised to come back next week, and we're going to talk about a few other things relative to the weather. So if you enjoyed it this week, don't miss Talk is Cheap next week.